In the summer of 1976, a chimpanzee named Melissa gave birth to twins at Gombe Stream Research Center in Tanzania. Within days, another chimpanzee, a female named Passion, attacked Melissa, seized one of the infants, and killed it. Then she ate it. Her adolescent daughter Pom assisted. It wasn't a one-time event. Over the following 3 years, Passion and Pom killed and cannibalized at least 3 more infants from other females in the troop, and possibly as many as 6. Jane Goodall, who had been studying the Gombe chimpanzees for over 15 years by that point, described it as the most disturbing thing she had witnessed in decades of fieldwork. She wrote that if Passion had been human, she would have been called a serial killer. That comparison opens a question worth taking seriously. Was Passion a psychopath? Can animals be psychopaths? And if something like psychopathy exists in non-human animals, what does that tell us about what psychopathy actually is? Psychopathy in humans is defined by a cluster of traits: shallow emotional responses, lack of empathy, absence of guilt, impulsivity, and a tendency to use other people instrumentally without regard for their well-being. It's not a formal diagnosis in the DSM. Clinicians use the related category of antisocial personality disorder, but it's a well-studied construct with measurable neurological correlates. Psychopathic individuals show reduced activity in the amygdala and ventromedial prefrontal cortex, regions involved in emotional processing and moral decision-making. The differences are structural and consistent enough to be detected on a brain scan. The immediate problem with applying this to animals is that we can't administer the standard psychopathy assessments to a chimpanzee, and we can't run an fMRI on a wild meerkat. What we can do is observe behavior and ask whether it matches the functional profile, whether an animal is acting in ways that in a human would indicate the underlying trait cluster. This is contested territory. Some researchers think the anthropomorphism risk is high enough that we should avoid the term entirely when talking about animals. Others argue that if the behavioral and neurological machinery is homologous, if it's the same basic system doing the same basic job, then the label is as meaningful applied to a chimp as it is applied to a person. The debate reflects a genuine tension in comparative psychology between taking animal cognition seriously and overclaiming similarity to human experience. What most researchers do agree on is this: the traits that define psychopathy in humans, reduced empathy, social manipulation, willingness to harm others for personal gain, have clear analogs in animal behavior, and those analogs appear in multiple species that form complex social structures. To understand why, you have to think about cooperation. Most social animals live in groups because cooperation produces better outcomes than solitude. Collective defense, collaborative hunting, shared care of offspring. The math works out in favor of staying together. But cooperation creates a vulnerability. Individuals who take the benefits of group membership without contributing to its costs can do very well, at least in the short term. Game theorists call these individuals defectors. In a population of cooperators, a single defector has a significant advantage. It gets everything the cooperators produce while paying none of the costs. But here's the catch: as defectors multiply, the advantage disappears. Too many defectors and the cooperative system collapses, leaving everyone worse off, including the defectors. What evolutionary models consistently show is that most stable social systems end up with a small, persistent minority of defectors. The exact proportion varies by species and context, but the pattern is robust. Pure cooperation isn't evolutionarily stable because it's always vulnerable to exploitation. The result is a mixed equilibrium, mostly cooperators, some defectors, each strategy keeping the other in check. This is not a metaphor for psychopathy. It's a mathematical framework that predicts psychopathy-like traits should exist in social species at low but stable frequencies as a natural outcome of selection pressure. The traits aren't a malfunction, they're an alternative strategy that evolution has repeatedly arrived at independently because in the right conditions it works. Back to Passion and Pom. The infant killing at Gombe wasn't random violence. Goodall's analysis and subsequent research building on her record suggests it was strategic. The primary beneficiary was Passion herself. By killing the infants of other females, she reduced competition for her own offspring, and potentially for food resources within the troop. Her daughter Pom was learning the behavior and presumably stood to inherit its benefits. What makes the case striking is the apparent absence of the social inhibitions that normally prevent this kind of behavior in chimpanzees. Chimps do commit infanticide. It's documented across many populations, typically by males killing unrelated infants when taking over a group. But lethal attacks by females on the infants of other group members, carried out repeatedly over years by the same individuals, is rare enough that it reads as something qualitatively different. These were not animals reacting to unusual circumstances. They were running a consistent behavioral program that other members of the troop were not running. Melissa, the female who lost her twins, was observed to become highly protective and vigilant in subsequent pregnancies. Other females in the troop showed similar behavioral changes during the years Passion and Pom were active. The group adapted to the presence of these individuals the way groups sometimes adapt to members who can't be trusted. Meerkats offer a different but comparably well-documented case. Meerkat groups are cooperative breeders. Multiple adults contribute to raising pups, sharing foraging duties and sentinel responsibilities. Dominant females who do most of the reproducing have developed a consistent strategy for maintaining that dominance. When subordinate females in the group give birth, the dominant female frequently kills their pups. This is not occasional or situational in well-studied meerkat populations. Dominant females kill subordinate pups at high rates, sometimes within hours of birth. They also evict pregnant subordinates from the group during the late stages of pregnancy, forcing them to give birth alone outside the group's protection. The behavior is so consistent, it's considered a defining feature of meerkat reproductive biology. The mechanism appears to be hormonal as well as behavioral. Dominant females have elevated testosterone and cortisol levels compared to subordinates, profiles associated with aggression and stress. Responses. The neurological and physiological differences between dominant and subordinate meerkats are measurable, consistent, and correlated with the behavioral differences. Is this psychopathy? The dominant female isn't failing to cooperate, she's actually central to group cohesion in other respects. But she's applying a completely different moral calculus to the infants of subordinates than to her own offspring, and she's doing it systematically. The empathy that regulates most social behavior within the group appears to have a sharp boundary that stops well short of competitor pups. Dolphins present a more uncomfortable case because they're the animals we're most culturally invested in seeing as intelligent and benign. Bottlenose dolphins form complex, long-term social alliances. Males, in particular, build multi-level coalitions, pairs, and trios that cooperate to herd females, and larger alliances of these pairs and trios that compete with other alliances. The social cognition required to navigate these relationships is genuinely sophisticated. Dolphins have been documented calling each other by individual names, long-term memory of allies and rivals, and something that looks like political maneuvering. They also engage in behaviors with no apparent survival function beyond the harm they cause. Groups of male dolphins have been observed herding and coercing females for extended periods, days or weeks, in what researchers term coercive consortship. Young dolphins and porpoises have been killed by males in ways that don't fit any straightforward adaptive explanation. There are documented cases of groups of dolphins repeatedly targeting and striking other animals, including humans, in ways that look less like predation or defense, and more like what you'd call, in a human context, gratuitous violence. None of this negates the cooperative, complex social life that dolphins clearly have. It complicates it. The same cognitive sophistication that enables alliance building and long-term social memory also enables manipulation and deliberate harm. These may not be independent features, which raises the question that the animal cases circle around without quite answering. Is psychopathy a thing that an individual has, or a thing that a situation produces? In humans, the clinical model treats psychopathy as a stable trait, something about the person present across contexts rooted in neurology. But research on antisocial behavior more broadly has consistently shown that context matters enormously. People who score low on empathy measures in controlled settings sometimes behave prosocially in their own communities. People who behave prosocially in controlled settings sometimes behave in ways that would score very high on psychopathy measures when given power and reduced accountability. The animal cases are ambiguous in the same way. Passion killed infants within her own troop, but was otherwise a normal group member. Dominant meerkats are functional social animals who happen to be systematically lethal toward a specific category of competitors. Male dolphins who participate in coercive consortships also maintain long-term cooperative alliances. One possibility is that psychopathy in the clinical sense, the stable, cross-context trait profile seen in the most extreme human cases, is a specific manifestation of a much more general feature of social cognition, the capacity to modulate empathy and moral inhibition based on social category. Most social animals apply something like empathy selectively. In-group members get it. Out-group members often don't. Competitors for critical resources often don't. Strangers usually don't. What looks like psychopathy in animals might be this ordinary categorical selectivity applied in unusual ways to in-group members, to the young of allies, to individuals who don't fit neatly into the social categories the animal's empathy system is calibrated to recognize as protected. The honest answer to "can animals be psychopaths" is that it depends what you mean by the question. If you mean, do some individual animals show a stable pattern of reduced empathy, social manipulation, and willingness to harm group members that makes them function differently within their social group than most members? Yes, clearly. The behavioral evidence is solid across multiple species. If you mean, do those animals have the neurological profile we associate with human psychopathy? Probably some of them, in some respects, though the research tools to answer this definitively in wild. Animals don't yet exist. If you mean, is there a category of animal that experiences the world the way a human psychopath does, that's a question about subjective experience that behavioral research can't currently reach. What the animal cases do establish is that the behaviors psychopathy produces in humans aren't aberrations in any deep sense. They're variations on strategies that appear across the animal kingdom and social species selected for because they work often enough to persist. Passion wasn't broken. She was, from a cold evolutionary standpoint, effective. The troop adapted to her the way populations adapt to defectors, by becoming more vigilant, more protective, more suspicious. The discomfort that Goodall reported feeling when documenting those years at Gombe wasn't just about the violence. It was about what the violence implied, that a chimpanzee could do something so systematic and so harmful to members of her own group, and that the group's main response was to adjust around her, rather than eliminate her. That's not a story about an animal failing to be human. It might be a story about what social life actually requires and what it quietly tolerates to keep functioning.